Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. A reminder that this episode will also appear on Food Tank's podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Before I start today's conversation with economist Josef Schmidhuber, I want to share some headlines I've read over the last few weeks. From The Economist, the world's food system so far has weathered the challenge of COVID-19, but things could still go awry. COVID-19 is exacerbating food shortages in Africa. Economic blow of COVID-19 hits America's already stressed farmers. Pandemic causes meat prices to soar. India reinventing agriculture in the time of COVID-19, etc. So you see there's a lot of sort of, very kind of bleak news around what this pandemic is doing to agriculture and our food systems across the world. I'm married to an agricultural economist, so these are kind of dinner time conversations for us, especially right now when we're hunkered down. And, what I'm most concerned about is that farmers and farms of any size have really been affected deeply by this crisis. Small farmers, obviously, in the global south, big commodity farmers all over the world. So this is something that, is hitting agriculture in very dire ways. And so I'm glad that we have our guest, Josef Schmidhuber, here today to sort of unpack some of these issues and unpack some of these problems. He serves as the Deputy Director of the Trade and Markets Division of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. As an economist, he conducts research on markets for commodity crops, global nutrition and food trade, climate change, and the impact of bioenergy on agricultural markets. And he recently co-authored two reports. One is entitled COVID-19, Channels of Transmission to Food and Agriculture, and the other is Comparing Crises, Great Lockdown versus Great Recession. So, Josef, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, we've been talking to several experts, a lot of your colleagues from FAO and others, and I have, for one, been really impressed by how open FAO has been to discussing the ways to confront COVID-19 publicly, and also sort of the institution's willingness to admit that they don't have all the answers, that they're figuring this out as we all are as we go along. And the mission of FAO is really to create a world without hunger, but a global crisis like COVID-19 really puts that at risk. I think we were making, huge strides over the last decade, and now a lot of those things are being reversed. And so I'm wondering, especially the first report you wrote, COVID-19 Channels of Transmission to Food and Agriculture, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of that work and some of the points that you made in the report and why they're so important.
Okay, perhaps I start with the big picture. The big picture actually starts with the macroeconomic environment. Mm-hmm. And perhaps I also compare this with the previous crisis. So if you don't mind, I would combine actually the two papers in a way in going through these questions. So what is really fundamentally different this time around is that we see a much stronger contraction in economic activity. Just to give you the headline numbers, we had just minus 0.1% during the financial crisis in 2009, whereas we are now, at least according to the IMF, expecting minus 3% globally. And that's really a completely different crisis. So it's a massive contraction in GDP. If one takes, again, the IMF numbers and takes the year 2020 and 21, then the cumulative output loss will be around $9 trillion. Put this into context, meaning essentially comparing this with US GDP. This is essentially wiping out 40% or nearly 50% of US GDP. That's an enormous economic loss. And the IMF just today said that this is probably an underestimate, so the contraction could even be worse. So that's really different. What is also quite different compared to the past is that And that may sound strange, but it's true. The 2009 recession, the Great Recession, as we call it, was mainly a recession of OECD countries, of rich countries, of industrialized countries. Whereas now, practically all countries will be affected. But of course, particularly developed countries, but also very much so commodity exporters and developing countries. And that's often overlooked, were sailing through the post-crisis almost unscathed. I'm talking about not necessarily about their agricultural situation and their food situation, but their overall GDP situation. So they saw very little contraction in GDP. We didn't expect it at the time of the last crisis, but with hindsight, we know that GDP contractions were almost limited to OECD countries. And so that's a fundamental difference. Developing countries will be particularly hit, and they will not be hardest hit, but they will be hard hit. Particularly hard hit will be the so-called SIDS, the small island developing states.
Right. And why? Why are they hit harder, do you think?
Because actually they're exposed through three main channels of transmission. So the first is tourism. Some of them actually get up to 70% of their GDP from tourism.
Right.
These are the typical islands like the Seychelles or the Maldives, and it can even be more. Then the next channel of transmission is the high dependency on food imports. So some of them get 70-80% of total food just from imports. And with all sorts of problems that we see in the supply chains, that of course is a problem for them. And then remittances play a big role. So not for all of them, but Haiti or Tonga get more than 30% of their income from remittances. And remittances are heavily affected. And I'm happy to explain why.
Yeah, we talked to your colleague Maximo Torero about that, but I think diving into that a little bit more, because I don't think people, especially in the global north or the Western world, really understand the importance of remittances and how fundamental they are to the economies of these small island states, whether we're talking about the Seychelles or the Caribbean, Haiti, Dominican Republic, elsewhere.
Well, exactly, because it makes such a big share of their GDP, it can hit them very strongly. And why does it actually happen? Let me give you an example from the Near East. So a lot of South Asian, a good part of the South Asian population is actually working in the so-called GCCs, in the Gulf Cooperation countries. And as the Gulf Cooperation countries are very hard hit by the crisis because of low revenues from oil, because a high dependency on the hospitality sector, because high dependency on transportation, on airlines, etc., a lot of the workers in the GCCs are essentially unemployed. And as they're unemployed, they have no way of sending back money. And that goes not only into the Maldives, but into many other places in South Asia. So clearly that's a problem.
Absolutely. And, I wasn't even thinking about, places like the United Arab Emirates and, how important the hospitality sector is there for remittances and that kind of thing. It's quite astounding how many people sort of along the whole chain have been affected by this. Rich countries are obviously responding much differently than COVID-19 compared to poor countries. Can you describe some of the differences that you outlined in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So rich countries, of course, have different means, both on the monetary side as well as on the fiscal side. So what we see on the monetary side is that practically all central banks have reduced interest rates, and considerably so. Many moved into negative territory, and the Federal Reserve is very close to doing that too. So there's an argument as to whether they should do it, when they will do it, etc. But in Europe, that's already common practice. And that's also a big difference compared to the last crisis. So quantitative easing, negative interest rates were completely unknown. And if you cast yourself back, had anybody told you in 2006 that we will see negative interest rates actually relatively soon, you would have said that's completely impossible. It will not happen. And we wouldn't even know how it should happen. No, it's commonplace. So it's not anything unusual. Except that actually, again, developing countries are differently affected. So while we saw interest rates coming down in many developed countries, they are actually rising in developing countries. So on average by 3.5%. So that's a big difference. That increases the cost of credit and the cost of doing business.
What does that
but also
mean?
on the
Sorry to interrupt. What does that mean for an actual farmer? A small or medium-sized farmer?
Yeah, okay. So it depends on the capital intensity and the debt equity ratio of a farm. In Latin America, you have a lot of very capital intensive production forms. So the typical row crop producers, the producers of soybeans, maize, etc., they all require quite a bit of capital. And unlike many of their peers in Europe, their debt equity ratios are relatively high, meaning that they actually need a lot of capital for which they pay interest.
Right.
In order to sustain their production. So clearly they are hard hit. They benefited from a depreciation of the exchange rate, but otherwise, yeah, they have been hard hit.
And for commodity farmers in places like sub-Saharan Africa, how are they being hit?
Okay, the channels of transmissions are quite different there because their production is labor intensive. It's actually capital saving. And they will be affected directly simply because they themselves or their farm laborers are affected by COVID or by quarantine or similar measures. So it's a different channel of transmission, but no doubt it can be very severe.
Absolutely. So obviously farmers in low-income countries are more vulnerable to COVID, the shocks brought on by COVID-19 and shocks brought on by, climate change and natural disasters and that kind of thing. I'm not an expert in financing structure for farmers, but how do we look at finance in low-income countries compared to high-income countries? What are sort of the differences?
Well, there's a lot of informal financial arrangements, including microfinance.
Right.
As interest rates go up, they are also affected. So it's different, but the production is much less capital intensive. So they rely more on their own workforce than on machinery or on technology. So that is not such a strong channel of transmission for the farmers there. It's much more in developed countries, but also in capital-intensive production systems in developing countries. Take the Latin American producers, so soybean, maize, and other crops in Latin America are produced in the same way as in US and Europe. Right. In Africa, it's different.
So, places that are practicing microfinance, do you think that because they've been doing this differently for so long that they'll come out a little bit better because they're not so dependent on other structures?
Well, they face their own challenges. In times of uncertainty, they will also face greater problems actually accessing microfinance, simply because there is a much greater risk that the farmer cannot produce his crop or her crop and cannot pay back the microcredit, and that will immediately be reflected in the risk, and risk means higher interest rates.
Right. You've been talking a lot about sort of differences in labor and how sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, is very dependent on big inputs of labor and sort of that human capital. But as COVID hits those countries, the availability of labor will go down, I imagine, as people are physical distancing or they're getting sick, unfortunately. How will that affect agricultural production? I mean, I think it's an easy question to answer, but what will be the economic sort of impact of that?
Well, it will, of course, go down. To what extent, we don't know. But other things equal, agricultural production will directly be affected. So in the extreme case, they face a very tough choice, and that's either to starve or to die from COVID.
Right. Very bleak. It's very bleak. You mentioned in one of your reports that it's not the quantity of food production that will go down. It's the quality. And this is something that I'm very concerned about, because I feel like that was one of the big strides we've made over the last decade, is really focusing less on calories and more on nutrient dense crops. And so I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, the shortages of fruits and vegetables and nutritious grains.
Okay, so as far as the bulk commodities are concerned, the grains, the oilseeds, etc., the world is actually awash in food supplies. There's no shortage. We have almost record high stocks. We have very good crops. We have super low prices. We have no profitability of bioethanol, so no competition on the demand side. There is no shortage whatsoever, at least on the international market. There can be some local shortages, no doubt about this. But given the fact that fruits and vegetables, for instance, are labor intensive everywhere, and given the quarantine restrictions, fruits and vegetable prices have gone up everywhere. And we see actually the same in the meat packing industry. So given the fact that this is actually a rather labor intensive process, exactly the same problems hit the meat packing industry. And that's why we have an almost absurd situation where farmers get very little for their cattle or their pigs, whereas the consumers have to pay a lot for their pork and their beef. So labor shortage there is an immediate problem and translates into higher prices, both on the fruits and vegetable side as well as on the meat side. And in addition to this, we have local problems, like in China, we have African swine fever that has wiped out 50% of pig meat production in China, and that adds to upward pressure on prices. So one can of course argue about the nutritional value of pig meat, but it's a staple food in China. It certainly has affected poor consumers in an extraordinary way.
Well, and swine fever is now spreading from China to other countries, so that's also a big concern. Can you dig a little deeper into sort of the effect on dietary quality? What do you sort of expect over the next year, 18 months?
Certainly it will reduce the availability of fruits and vegetables, and that has already happened. Fruits and vegetable prices are much higher than they used to be. Places like the SIDS are most strongly affected. You may actually ask yourself why. It's actually something rather simple. The same actually holds for the Gulf Cooperation states. It has to do with the fact that we have a lot less passenger flights. And a lot of these fruits and vegetables in particular, they're air freighted into these places. So the tomatoes come by passenger planes. They come in the bellies of passenger planes, and the same for all the berries and eggplants and whatever. And given the fact that there is no or very little passenger traffic, there's also a lot less traffic and a lot less shipment in fruits and vegetables.
Right, yeah. It's sort of an unintended consequence, but all of this has been really full of unintended consequences, I think. So, we've talked about the food and financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. We've talked about, 2011. What can be learned from these past crises? How can we learn for this one? I know they're very different in lots of ways, but I know there are also some similarities. So what are the lessons that we can learn?
Okay, I spoke already about the monetary side. I haven't spoken about the fiscal side. So what I think policymakers have reacted relatively swiftly, and they also reacted in the right way. So they really opened the gates for, as far as fiscal easing is concerned, at least in the G20, in the richer countries, both in US and in Europe. The development that we see probably in everything but name is what is described in terms of modern monetary theory. So we actually see a lot of fiscal easing, fiscal accommodation, with a lot of help provided to both producers and consumers, enterprises and final consumers. So that's a major difference to the reaction to the crisis in 2007, 2008, where policymakers helped a little, cash for clunkers and similar products and measures, but overall, actually, particularly in the aftermath, in the 2010s, there was a lot of austerity rather than fiscal easing. And I think even in Europe, the message, it becomes now much clearer that this is not the solution to this problem. So it really requires fiscal easing at the same time. In fact, monetary easing makes no sense at the level where we are at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering what most worries you right now, and maybe how that's changed from 2 months ago when the crisis first began.
Well, we don't know yet what the impacts in Africa will be. So there are certainly countries in Africa that are hit by a number of concurrent crises, and that is really something that keeps us awake every night. So that the problem there is that we have, as Mr. Adesina from the president of the African Development Bank calls it, locust 19, underlying that the locust problem there is as big as COVID-19. Right. So it's a huge problem in East Africa, and it reduces food availability there right away. In addition, we have civil strife, we have terrorism in many African countries, and that undermines supply chains, it undermines production possibilities, etc. Another problem. Then we have COVID, so a health crisis. We don't know to what extent this affects either workforce or the supply chains or both. So another big problem. So yeah. Concurrent crisis, absolutely, in Africa.
Absolutely. Yeah, the locust plague is just, I don't know if anyone is interested, but they should watch the videos of produced by BBC of how huge these locust plagues are, and the impact that they will have on food security, especially in Eastern Africa, is unheard of. It's hard for me to wrap my head around. In terms of recommendations, for policymakers, for the global north, what are your biggest recommendations? And then on the flip side, for the global south?
I think one of the problems that I see now is that in the global north, that occupational health and safety standards can really be undermined. That has to do with the enormous pressure on the workforce. A lot of people are laid off, and those who continue to work are facing very tough working conditions. The epitome probably of that is the slaughterhouse industry, the meat packers. And so that is a big worry, and I hope that policymakers react to this and ensure minimal occupational health and safety standards and decent wages and do not allow subcontractors to subcontract subcontractors who subcontract other subcontractors who at the end of the day do not respect any occupational health and safety standards. So that's certainly something that the global north has to look into. As far as the global south is concerned, it's very important to maintain supply chains alive, and both on the input and the output side, so that we ensure that there is fertilizer, that there is seeds, that there are feeds, that everything actually flows in a smooth way to the extent it can be smooth in the current circumstances. And of course, because we have local food availability problems, there is a role for the WFP for providing food aid where the needs are the greatest.
And yeah, they have a huge job ahead of them right now because, as you said, the crisis hasn't fully hit sub-Saharan Africa. So when it does, there will be sort of an astronomical amount of need, I at least think. I'm wondering, Joseph, you work on a lot of bleak things. This is not a lot of good news, right? What would make you feel better about this situation if you could sort of wave your magic wand and in sort of an economic way or a market way? What approach would you use personally, which is the crisis for many?
The problem in agriculture is that we are just seeing the symptoms. We don't have any means to address the root cause of the problem. So the root cause of the problem is a health problem, and that needs to be addressed. And that can only be addressed either by better medication or by vaccination. Right. And so if I could wave my magic wand, I would try to produce both vaccines and medication, and hopefully make that available as a global public good. So nobody should be excluded from having access to vaccination. That's absolutely key. In the meantime, So personal protection equipment is, of course, very important, and that should be provided to all those who are particularly exposed, be it now in the health sector or in the food processing sector or wherever it is, that is key. So all the essential jobs should really be protected.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you called for, better protection of those workers, including better wages. That's fundamental right now for these workers to be able to, feel safe at work, or feel at least safer at work, and also be able to feed their own families. Okay. So Josef, my last question is, who is inspiring you the most right now? Who's giving you hope?
I wouldn't want to reduce it to a person, but the fact that the agricultural system so far actually has been rather resilient at the calorie level, so that we avoid a major famine, that is really giving me hope. And I think we will get through this crisis, not unscathed, but we will get through the crisis eventually. So that's really giving me hope. I hope that the system remains resilient, that no country falls back into very unproductive policies as we had it in the last crisis with export restrictions and things like this, that trade remains open and markets remain open. That's absolutely fundamental for sailing through this crisis without major injuries.
Right. Agriculture is very resilient, I agree. And I think so many strides that have been made over the last decade, as you have talked about before, have created, a better situation so that we don't go backward, or at least we don't go backward too far. To find out more information about Josef's work, you can go to FAO.org and the FAO Trade and Markets Division, which is easy to find on their website. Thanks so much for joining me, Josef. You were a pleasure.
Thanks, Danny.
You've depressed me a little bit, but you also gave me some hope. A reminder that this episode will also be on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And please join me for our next episode. I'll be talking to Rose Hayden-Smith, who will be talking about the history of Victory Gardens. Josef, please stay safe and well.
Thanks, you too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye.